What came first, tea or coffee? When it comes to the earliest consumption as a beverage, tea is older than coffee. But when it comes to adoption on a global scale, coffee became the worldwide choice of beverage before tea. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaur, and today we are looking at the two most popular beverages across the globe, tea and coffee, their history, their impact, and their spread as a global beverage. Coffee originated in Ethiopia, and around about the middle of the 15th century, there was a small-scale trade in coffee between Ethiopia and Yemen. The first documented use of coffee was among the Sufi religious societies in the late 15th century. It was used as a devotional aid in Sufi ceremonies since it allowed the devotees to perform the rituals well into the night. Coffee spread rapidly in the Near East, and by the time the Ottoman Turks conquered Egypt in 1517, coffee drinking was already widespread in Cairo. And within the next few decades, coffee was enjoyed across that region from North Africa to the Mughal Empire in India. Within the course of a century, coffee became a part of the social fabric of that region. For the first few decades of the 16th century, the vast majority of coffee cultivation was carried out in Ethiopia. But in 1544, the Imam of Yemen insisted that coffee be cultivated in Yemen as well. And from then on, the majority of Middle Eastern coffee cultivation took place in the highlands of Yemen. It was the Yemeni port of Mocha that came to have a monopoly on coffee distribution to the Islamic world. The spread of coffee to the rest of the world took place in the 17th century. To maintain their monopoly on its control, coffee merchants in Mocha prohibited the distribution of live seedlings or seeds of the coffee plant. But that did not prevent the British East India Company from starting to trade in coffee. By 1620, they had jumped on to the coffee bandwagon, and it was the British East India Company that sold coffee to the Mughal Empire in India. Coffee eventually made its way to Europe, and it spread as rapidly there as it had a century earlier in the Middle East. The first British coffee house was opened in Oxford in 1651, and it was an immediate success, particularly among university faculty and students. And soon coffee houses spread across continental Europe as well, though the coffee was still imported from the Middle East. But by the end of the 17th century, the Yemeni monopoly on coffee production finally broke down. And this is often tied to the last Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683. Apparently, as the Ottomans retreated, they supposedly left behind large stores of coffee, both in the form of coffee beans and raw seeds and seedlings. Subsequently, the Dutch East India Company established a coffee plantation on the Indonesian island of Java in 1699, and other European powers soon followed. The French began growing coffee in the Caribbean, the Spaniards started growing coffee in Central America, and the Portuguese in Brazil. An interesting point to note is that during that time, as coffee production became globalized, coffees began to be sold according to the port of their origin. So Mocha and Java were specific varieties of coffee sold from the ports that bore their name. The other interesting piece about coffee was that because it was sold as beans, it was not very conducive to preparing at home. So it needed to be ground and then it was cooked in large vats, pots, or cauldrons. And as a result of this, it had to be mass distributed, which means both in the Middle East and Europe, coffee houses sprung up. So people, mostly men, gathered in these coffee houses to read, discuss news, religion, politics, and just chat. So both in the Middle East and in Europe, outside of the workplace and place of worship, there were very few places for people to meet socially. And the coffee houses suddenly became an ideal place for social gathering. The Ottoman authorities were quick to diagnose the potential problems the social gathering concept introduced. The Ottomans were worried that these social gathering coffee houses could serve as hotbeds for sedition. So in 1544, the first of the many bans was issued on coffee houses. But over a period of time, none of these bans stuck, and ultimately, the coffee houses continued to do good business. The other issue in the Islamic world was whether or not coffee was an intoxicant and should it be forbidden under the Islamic law. Here too, nothing concrete came out, and in the end, the bans and the conflicts were never successful, primarily because the religious leaders themselves were divided on the issue. So in the end, the coffee shops stayed open. Similarly, in Europe and in the United States, coffee had a huge social impact. The coffee houses in London were called penny universities because admittance cost a penny, and the coffee houses were packed with people discussing the latest news and events. In fact, many political movements and institutions like the Lloyds of London and the London Stock Exchange took shape in the coffee houses of London. The American Declaration of Independence was first read in front of the Bunch of Grapes, a Boston coffee house. In Europe, coffee and tea changed the drinking habits not only by providing an alternative to alcohol, but by providing an alternative with a dramatically different drug effect. Now, alcohol is a depressant, but caffeine is a stimulant. And this fact was recognized by the coffee drinkers pretty quickly. Pope Clement VIII supposedly blessed coffee for its invigorating effects. And the literary coffee drinkers praised its ability to maintain focus and provide energy. Many writers and thinkers at the time were caffeine addicts, and they took advantage of coffee and tea to stay up well into the night. Also, around the same time, the Industrial Revolution began to stir in the second half of the 18th century, and caffeinated drinks helped the new industrial working class adjust to the demands of a workday that no longer conformed to the natural cycle of day and night. Coffee almost disappeared from the world in the late 19th century. Wait, disappeared? What does that mean? So coffee was being grown and produced in the regions of North Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The British took control of the island nation of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, in 1796. And since coffee was already growing there to a small extent, the British embarked upon large-scale cultivation starting 1824. The British identified the Candian highlands of Ceylon, which had a thick rainforest cover, as the region for production of coffee. Massive damage was done to the forest ecosystem to convert the forest to plantations. And subsequently, in the late 1860s, a fungal infection spread among the coffee plantations of Sri Lanka, and this was called coffee rust or left rust. It infected the leaves of coffee plants and had the ability to devastate an entire plantation. And it spread from Sri Lanka to other coffee producing regions in Asia and Africa. But interestingly, it did not spread to Latin America. And that eventually led to the consolidation of Latin American coffee and its dominance in the late 19th century. The share of Java in the global coffee market plummeted after 1873 because of this fungus, and Sri Lanka itself abandoned coffee production in the late 1880s and switched to the cultivation of tea. And among Latin American nations, Brazil seized the opportunity to become the top coffee producing region in the world. And it holds that position even today. Brazil is largely also credited for the explosion of affordable coffee in the 19th century, and this saw a shift from the respectable sipping drink to the common chugging drink. And as Brazil's economy began to center around coffee production, its social structure also began to center around coffee. Coffee planters formed a powerful political bloc, coffee merchants became wealthy, and the entire banking system was deeply enmeshed within the coffee industry. Tea, on the other hand, originated in China around 2750 BC. It was initially consumed mainly for its medicinal properties, and it took about 3,000 years to become a popular drink throughout the Chinese Empire. During the Tang dynasty, which was from 600 to 900 AD, the popularity of tea was recognized by the imposition of a tax. And during the Ming dynasty, which was from 1368 to 1644 AD, steamed and dry loose leaves became popular. In order to protect their crop, Chinese merchants started to roast their leaves to prevent them from rotting. And the leaves that were left in the air to oxidize produced black tea. And black tea was manufactured mainly for export. The Dutch were the first to introduce tea in Europe, shipping it in around 1610. Tea was introduced to Britain around 1650, a few years after coffee had reached England. And it was through the coffeehouses that tea spread to the people. And it quickly became the drink of choice, completely outspacing alcohol. And because of this, the British government began to lose all revenue from taxes on alcohol. So they remedied the situation by imposing a heavy tax on tea. But this led to widespread tea smuggling, and it was not till 1785 that the government, under pressure from tea merchants, drastically reduced the import taxes to 12.5%, effectively ending the smuggler's trade. By the year 1800, tea was easily the most popular drink in Great Britain. The problem? All the tea came from China, and China was charging silver bullion in exchange for the tea. And clearly, the British could not afford this trade in the long run. So the British started growing opium in India and smuggling it into China in exchange for the tea. The Chinese emperor hated opium as the medium of exchange because a nation of drug addicts was being created. So in spring of 1839, the emperor confiscated all the opium and destroyed it. And this was about 1,400 tons. And this led to the First Opium War. And it is at that point that the British realized that if they were going to keep pace with the British tea consumption, They could not rely on China, and they had to own the product themselves. So around 1850, a group of British businessmen set out to create a tea industry in a place that they controlled. The place was India. Their plan was to smuggle tea leaves and seeds from China into India. And their accomplice was a young botanist, Robert Fortune. Robert Fortune was a Scottish horticulturist. He had independently traveled to China in 1843 to study its tea plantations. And upon his return, he had published a book, 3 Years' Wandering in the Northern Provinces of China. The book caught the attention of the East India Company, and they recruited Robert Fortune to be their scout in carrying out the Great British Tea Heist. In the fall of 1848, Fortune entered China on his espionage mission. He shaved his head and donned the disguise of a Mandarin and traveled to the Chinese highlands to inspect the 2,000-year-old tea manufacturing process. He returned to Shanghai in 1849, from where he contacted his employers in London, informing them that he had procured a large supply of seeds and young plants which would get safely to India. Fortune had pinched about 13,000 plant samples and 10,000 seeds and managed to smuggle them in glass bottles through Hong Kong and Calcutta. And these were planted successfully in what would become the tea estates of Assam and Darjeeling. And by 1888, India's tea exports into Britain were over 86 million pounds, exceeding China's 80 million pounds. And within a short period of time, India had surpassed China as the biggest producer of tea in the world. It took China another 100 years to regain its status as the top tea grower across the globe. And because of its impact, Robert Fortune's tea heist is often considered the biggest theft of intellectual property in the modern era. No story on tea can be complete without the mention of the Boston Tea Party. During the era of colonization, Britain taxed its colonies on various goods and commodities, and tea was one of them. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company exclusive rights to ship tea to the colonies. This did not sit well in America, and on December 16, 1773, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and others, boarded a ship from the East India Company and dumped chests of tea into the Boston harbor. And this incident is called the Boston Tea Party. And this is important because this incident made tea symbolic of the crown's oppression. And slowly, many colonists started switching to drinking coffee. Now, fast forward to 1804, when Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. And after losing to Britain in the Battle of Trafalgar, he decided to create the continental system, in which areas under French control were to strive for self-sufficiency. The hope was to bankrupt Britain's overseas trading empire. And the result of that was the demand for coffee dropped drastically in Europe. And as a result, the coffee-producing nations in South America were encouraged to look at the United States to be their major consumer for coffee. And the United States did not disappoint. During the 19th century, the US became the single largest consumer of coffee, and by the end of the century, it was importing 40% of the world's total amount of coffee. And the United States continues to be the single largest coffee importer. And the proximity to the Latin American coffee producing nations has helped ensure a balance between demand and supply. Talking of demand and supply, both tea and coffee were naturally bitter, so they needed sugar to temper the bitterness, which meant as the demand for tea and coffee grew worldwide, the demand for sugar grew dramatically. And it is on that sweet note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Currently, only 13 countries recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, which was the last country to sever ties with Taiwan. In 2021, Nicaragua established diplomatic relations with mainland China and severed its ties with Taiwan, becoming the latest country to do so. So the answer is D, Nicaragua. Question for the current episode. Which three countries are in the top 10 tea and coffee producers in the world? That is, which three countries figure in the top 10 tea producers as well as in the top 10 coffee producers? Is it A, Brazil, Colombia and Turkey, B, India, Indonesia and Vietnam, C, Sri Lanka, Kenya and Ethiopia, or D, Honduras, Iran and Argentina? Once again, which three countries are in the top 10 tea and coffee producers in the world? A, Brazil, Colombia and Turkey, B, India, Indonesia and Vietnam, C, Sri Lanka, Kenya and Ethiopia, or D, Honduras, Iran and Argentina? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. We'll now break for the holidays, and the next episode will air in about a month's time on January the 7th. And in that episode, we'll cover some great spy operations in modern times, from the capture of a top-ranking Nazi criminal to the decoding of top-secret messages. Till then, stay safe, have a very happy new year, but keep exploring the why in history.